Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Imagine it's the dead of night in your quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows your business, but pretends they don't, and you're half asleep when that insistent knocking jolts you awake at 1 in the morning. So you open the door to find your only daughter standing there with tears streaming down her face and a split lip bleeding onto her shirt, sobbing that her husband hit her because of another woman, which sends your blood running cold even as something deep inside steadies you. Enough to pull her inside, sit her down with a blanket and ice, then slip away to the hall closet where your fingers brush against the old uniform still crisp from years in storage, catching your reflection in the mirror with those sharp, unyielding eyes reminding you of the fire that never quite faded, and finally dialing that secret number you've kept hidden for a decade to whisper into the phone that it's time to start the plan. Because what happens next when a mother like me decides that enough is truly enough isn't just about surviving one bad night, but about unraveling the whole tangled mess of betrayal and revenge that could change everything for better or worse. So stick around if you want to see how it all plays out in ways you might never expect. That insistent knocking had cut through the silence of my modest 2-bedroom ranch house on Elm Street sharper than any alarm I'd ever heard during my days in the Marines, pulling me from a fitful doze in the worn recliner where I'd been half watching some late-night infomercial promising miracle cleaners that somehow never lived up to their hype after a long 12-hour shift at the local hardware store that left my feet aching and my mind numb from dealing with endless questions about plumbing supplies and paint colors from customers who acted like they were the first to discover home improvement. My heart began pounding against my ribs with the force of distant artillery as I shuffled toward the front door in my slippers, the cool hardwood floor sending a chill up my legs. And I paused just long enough to peek through the peephole out of pure ingrained habit from years of deployments where trusting the wrong shadow could cost lives, only to see my 28-year-old daughter, Sarah, standing there on the porch looking as if she'd been dragged backward through the worst kind of hell imaginable, with her dark hair matted against her forehead from sweat and rain, her eyes swollen, nearly shut from crying, and that fresh blood trickling steadily from a split in her lower lip that stained the collar of her favorite blue sweater, the very one I'd splurged on for her last Christmas 2 years earlier when she was still pretending her marriage was the picture of suburban bliss. Without a second's hesitation, I flung the door wide open and wrapped my arms around her trembling frame before she could even choke out a single word, feeling her collapse against me as sobs racked her body so violently that it seemed like she might shatter right there in the entryway. And I guided her inside with gentle but firm hands while reaching back to lock the door with a decisive click that reverberated through the quiet house like a final judgment. The living room carried the faint lingering aroma of the pot roast I'd prepared earlier that evening for what was supposed to be a solitary dinner, now sitting cold and forgotten on the kitchen counter as a stark reminder of the ordinary life I'd built alone since my husband passed away 10 years ago from that sudden heart attack that left me navigating widowhood and single parenting with a stubborn resolve, honed from military service. Easing Sarah onto the sagging couch cushions, I hurried to the kitchen to dampen a clean dish towel under the faucet and returned to press it softly against her injured mouth, murmuring soothing words about how we'd get through this just like we always had, no matter how ugly it got, while my mind raced ahead trying to piece together the fragments of what must have led to this desperate midnight arrival. She wiped at her eyes with the back of one hand, smearing the remnants of her mascara across her cheeks in dark streaks that resembled some kind of improvised war paint from my old field days, and finally managed to steady her voice enough to start explaining through hiccuping breaths that it all stemmed from yet another explosive fight with her husband Mark earlier that evening when he'd come home late, once more reeking of cheap perfume and fast food wrappers she hadn't ordered, denying everything at first with that charming smile he used to sell houses to unsuspecting families, but then exploding in rage when she pressed him about the suspicious texts popping up on his phone from some woman at his real estate office who he'd been secretly seeing for months, while lying straight to Sarah's face every single day about his so-called long work hours and client dinners. Mark Thompson, the slick-talking salesman who'd swept my daughter off her feet right after she graduated from community college with dreams of stability and a family of her own. had always rubbed me the wrong way with his flashy wristwatches that screamed more debt than success and his endless tall tales about closing massive deals that somehow never translated into the financial security he promised. Yet Sarah had seen only potential in him, clinging to the hope of that cookie-cutter rental house downtown as if it could hold together the cracks that were already forming long before this latest betrayal surfaced. In such a violent way. I lowered myself onto the couch beside her, rubbing slow, comforting circles on her back the same way I'd done when she was a little girl terrified of thunderstorms rolling in over the Ohio plains, asking pointed questions to draw out more details without overwhelming her fragile state, like whether Mark had followed her during the drive over or if he might be lurking somewhere nearby waiting to make things worse. To which she shook her head vigorously while insisting that she'd slipped out the back door after the slap landed and driven straight here without stopping, though I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me because those bruises forming around her eye looked too familiar. Too much like the ones I'd suspected, but she'd always dismissed as accidents from bumping into furniture during her so-called clumsy moments at home. The idea of another woman complicating their already strained marriage explained so much: the unexplained late nights, the vague excuses about overtime, the way Sarah's confidence had eroded bit by bit over the past year, but the physical hitting crossed a line that no amount of stress or infidelity could ever justify, igniting a protective fury in me that I'd last felt during those tense nights in the barracks coordinating patrols under fire. Standing up carefully so as not to startle her further, I instructed Sarah to stay right there on the couch and catch her breath while I stepped away for just a moment, heading down the narrow hallway to the closet where old boxes of holiday decorations and forgotten keepsakes gathered dust, pulling open the door with a creak that echoed my growing determination, and lifting out my Marine Corps service uniform, still folded meticulously in its protective plastic wrap with the medals pinned in precise rows that brought back a flood of memories from deployments across dusty bases and high-stakes operations where I'd earned every one of those honors by keeping my squad alive through sheer grit and strategy. Holding the heavy fabric up to the faint glow filtering from the living room lamp, I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror hanging on the closet door, seeing not just the 52-year-old woman with a few extra pounds softened around the middle from too many comfort meals and gray streaks threading through my once dark hair, but the same fierce determination in my brown eyes that had carried me through boot camp and beyond, a reminder that age might slow the body, but never dulled the edge of resolve when family was on the line. Sarah watched me from her spot on the couch with a mix of confusion and exhaustion etching deeper lines on her young face, her voice tentative as she asked what on earth I was doing with that old uniform after all these years. But I simply offered a small nod of reassurance before pulling my phone from the pocket of my robe and scrolling through the contacts to the one labeled only as Eagle, a code name from my service days that connected me to a network of trusted veterans who'd stayed in touch through thick and thin, hitting the call button without hesitation even though it was the middle of the night. The line rang exactly twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered on the other end, thick with sleep, but instantly alert as he recognized my number and rasped out my name Elena in that no-frills tone that spoke of shared battles long past. And I kept my own voice low and steady as unyielding steel when I told him simply to start the plan right away, providing no further explanation because he understood the gravity from those 3 words alone, the weight of a protocol we'd hashed out years ago for emergencies just like this one where talking too much could tip the scales against us. As I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning to face Sarah, who now sat upright with the damp towel clutched in her hands and questions burning in her gaze about what plan I could possibly mean and why it involved pulling out relics from my military past, my own phone vibrated insistently in my pocket with an incoming text message from Eagle that made my stomach twist into knots as I read the brief warning that Mark was already on the move somewhere out there in the dark, suggesting he might have pieced together her destination faster than we'd hoped and was gearing up to make his next play before dawn could break over the sleepy streets of our small Ohio town. Sarah finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep on the couch sometime around 2 in the morning, her breathing evening out into shallow rhythms under the heavy afghan I'd draped over her like a shield against the chill that seemed to seep from every corner of the house after that frantic arrival, While I sat there in the dim lamplight watching over her with a mug of coffee clutched in my hands that had gone lukewarm from neglect as my mind churned through the possibilities of what Mark might do. Next, now that Eagle's warning text hung over us like a storm cloud promising thunder. The living room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with shadows from the flickering TV I'd muted earlier to avoid startling her, and I couldn't shake the image of her split lip or the way she'd trembled when recounting that backhanded slap. A betrayal that cut deeper than any battlefield wound I'd patched up in my service days, because this one struck at the heart of the family I'd fought so hard to hold together after losing my husband to that unexpected heart attack a decade ago, which left me raising Sarah alone through her teenage rebellions and my own quiet struggles at the hardware store job that paid the bills, but never quite filled the voids. By the time the first hints of dawn filtered through the curtains, turning the sky outside from inky black to a reluctant gray, I set the mug aside and busied myself in the kitchen brewing a fresh pot strong enough to wake the dead, or at least sharpen my focus for the digging I knew had to come. The rich aroma filling the air as I pulled out my laptop from the side table and settled at the scarred oak kitchen table where so many mother-daughter talks had unfolded over the years, now transformed into a makeshift command center for unraveling the lies that had poisoned Sarah's marriage. She stirred awake around 6 with a wince that twisted her features as she tentatively touched the swollen purple bruise blooming across her lower lip like an ugly flower no one wanted to see. And I slid a plate of scrambled eggs and buttered toast in front of her along with a glass of orange juice fresh from the fridge, keeping everything simple and nourishing because in moments like these comfort food could anchor you when everything else felt adrift. Then joined her at the table, pushing my own untouched plate aside to lean in and gently coax the full story from her without the pressure of accusations that might make her clam up again. We ate in a heavy silence, at first broken only by the clink of forks against ceramic. But eventually she opened up more freely, explaining how the fight had ignited over dinner the night before when Mark stumbled through the door well past 9, smelling of that cloying cheap perfume mixed with the greasy remnants of takeout from some dive she hadn't chosen herself, at first brushing off her questions with his usual disarming grin, the one that had sold so many houses to wide-eyed families dreaming of the American picket fence life, but then escalating into outright denial laced with anger when she grabbed his phone to scroll through those incriminating texts from Lacey Hargrove, the 32-year-old bleach-blonde coworker at his real estate firm who apparently had been whispering sweet nothings and planning secret weekend escapes for months, while Mark fed Sarah nothing but fabrications about overtime hours and essential client schmoozing sessions that kept him away night after night. Hearing it laid out like that stirred a mix of rage and sorrow in me, because Mark Thompson, with his polished sales pitches and over-the-top accessories like that gold watch that screamed borrowed money more than genuine success, had always struck me as too smooth for his own good, ever since he first charmed his way into Sarah's life right after her community college graduation, when she was full of optimism about building a stable future together in that rented colonial downtown that looked perfect from the outside, but hit the rod of financial strains and whispered arguments she downplayed during our weekly phone calls. I listened without interrupting, at first rubbing her hand across the table in silence support, the way I'd done during her high school heartbreaks or the tough times after my husband's funeral when grief made every day feel like wading through mud. But once she trailed off into quiet sniffles, I set the conversation on a firmer path by telling her plainly that she didn't have to rush back to that house or that man if staying here felt safer, because my door was always open no matter how messy the situation got. Though if she chose to remain, we needed every detail laid bare without any sugarcoating or protective omissions that could leave blind spots in whatever came next. Nodding slowly while picking at the crust of her toast, she admitted through fresh tears that the physical outbursts weren't entirely new, having started small about a year ago with shoves during arguments over money, but escalating to slaps like last night's after she'd confronted him one too many times about the growing distance and the suspicious charges on their credit card statements that pointed to hotel stays and gifts she never received. And though he'd sworn each time to seek counseling or make changes, Sarah had believed him every time, clinging to the remnants of the man who'd once made her laugh with his goofy impressions of quirky clients, because walking away meant admitting the dream they'd built was crumbling under the weight of his deceptions. That confession hit me hard, stirring memories of my own marriage's quieter battles where my husband and I had navigated deployments and bills with honest talks rather than hidden affairs. And it fueled my determination to act even as a wry humor bubbled up inside me, thinking how Mark's so-called charm was about as reliable as a screen door on a submarine in a storm. A light vulgarity in my mind's eye, picturing him squirming under the scrutiny he deserved without me voicing it aloud just yet to keep Sarah from shutting down. With her settled for a moment nursing her juice, I turned back to the laptop screen, its glow casting blue shadows across the kitchen walls as I began the discreet digging Eagle had set in motion overnight, starting with Mark's public social media profiles where he curated that facade of domestic bliss, posting curated photos of barbecues and date nights with Sarah that masked the reality of their strained evenings, but pushing further using the anonymous browsing tools and backdoor access codes my veteran network had shared over the years from old ops that taught us how to uncover truths buried under layers of digital smoke. I unearthed the affair in concrete terms, like forwarded emails between him and Lacey filled with flirty banter about stolen kisses in the office break room and plans for a cabin getaway up north that he'd funded by dipping into their joint savings without a word to Sarah. Scrolling through Lacey's LinkedIn profile, boasting her sales accolades and that polished headshot, smiling like she owned the world, only deepened the insult, because this wasn't just some fleeting indiscretion, but a calculated double life where Mark played the devoted husband by day and the cheating opportunist by night, leaving Sarah to shoulder the emotional wreckage alone. Sarah glanced over my shoulder, catching glimpses of the evidence, and buried her face in her hands, murmuring how stupid she felt for missing the signs that now seemed glaring in hindsight, like the unexplained lipstick stains on his collars or the way he'd guard his phone like state secrets, to which I pulled her close in a quick hug, assuring her that slick operators like Mark thrived on making smart women doubt themselves, but that we were flipping the script starting right then with no more illusions about his worth. That resolve led to my first taste of revenge, a small but satisfying jab crafted with the precision of a well-aimed shot as I composed an anonymous email to Mark's supervisor at the real estate firm, attaching a fabricated but plausible screenshot of an expense report showing him inflating mileage reimbursements for those phantom client meetings that doubled as rendezvous spots. Nothing outright illegal on my part, since it leaned on half-truths from the emails I'd found, but enough to plant seeds of doubt and trigger an internal audit that would keep him jumping through hoops for weeks, explaining every penny while his boss eyed him with newfound suspicion. Hitting send through a VPN tunnel to mask any traces gave me a quiet chuckle, imagining Mark's smug expression cracking under the pressure like an overripe tomato about to burst, especially since by noon I pictured him stuck in a stuffy conference room sweating bullets over coffee that tasted like regret, a witty payback that honored the old saying about giving a man enough rope to hang himself without me lifting a finger beyond the initial nudge. We spent the rest of the afternoon in deeper conversation, with Sarah gradually opening up about the emotional toll of living in that pressure cooker of a marriage, where Mark's promises to change after each incident rang hollow at each time, leaving her isolated from friends who warned her early on and trapped by the sunk costs of shared leases and dreams deferred. Though even as she vented, a flicker of defense crept into her words when she mentioned how hardworking he could be on good days, almost as if part of her still hoped to salvage something from the ruins, which planted a seed of conflict in my chest, making me wonder if she was truly ready to cut ties or if old patterns would pull her back into the fray. As evening shadows lengthened across the backyard, turning the maple trees' leaves to silhouettes against the fading light, I stepped out onto the porch for a breath of fresh air, the cool autumn breeze carrying hints of wood smoke from neighbors' fire pits, while I dialed Eagle for an update, his voice crackling over the line with news that he'd placed eyes on Mark, who was holed up at a dive bar downtown nursing beers and making frantic calls, probably to Lacey or damage control contacts. A small victory in knowing his night was as restless as mine had been, but then Sarah's phone lit up on the kitchen counter inside with a barrage of missed calls and texts from Mark's number that she ignored at my urging, though I caught the hesitation in her eyes, the way her fingers hovered before setting it to silent, suggesting the hold he still exerted wasn't fully broken. Just as I pocketed my own phone, preparing to head back inside, Eagle's next text buzzed through with chilling clarity, stating that Mark had pieced together Sarah's location at my place faster than anticipated and was already mobilizing whatever shady resources he could muster to head our way under the cover of darkness, leaving me to steel myself for the confrontation that loomed like an uninvited guest at the door. The prospect of Mark barreling toward my house under the veil of nightfall after Eagle's stark text warning had me herding Sarah deeper into the safety of the guest room with quick instructions to lock the door behind her and keep her phone on silent just in case while I positioned myself by the front window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to scan the empty street illuminated by the sporadic glow of sodium lamps that cast long eerie shadows across the lawns of our quiet Ohio suburb where neighbors like the Johnsons next door minded their own business unless gossip about a family drama started circulating at the local diner. My pulse thrummed steadily in my ears like the distant hum of engines during a night patrol as I waited in the dim hallway, the old uniform still draped over the banister nearby serving as a silent talisman of the strength I'd need if things turned physical. Because Mark's earlier texts had escalated from pleading apologies to veiled threats about how Sarah belonged to him, and no one, especially not her meddling mother, was going to interfere with their reconciliation, which only hardened my resolve to protect her at all costs, even if it meant drawing on skills from my Marine days that I'd hoped to leave buried, alongside the memories of sand-swept bases and close calls under fire. Around 8 o'clock, his battered pickup truck did indeed rumble into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the gathering dusk like accusatory fingers pointing straight at my door, and he wasted no time banging on the wood with fists that echoed through the house. His voice slurred from what smelled like a belly full of cheap whiskey as he bellowed for Sarah to come out and face him so they could talk this through like adults without outsiders complicating their private matters, to which I let him carry on for a full minute, building his frustration before cracking the door open just a sliver, my body blocking the entryway completely as I met his bloodshot gaze. With a stare cold enough to freeze motor oil, he pushed forward aggressively, trying to shoulder past me into the warmth of the foyer, but I planted my feet firmly, drawing on the balance drills from basic training to hold my ground unyielding as a concrete barrier, while telling him in a voice laced with steel that Sarah wasn't in any condition to entertain his version of a heart-to-heart tonight, and that he needed to turn around, drive off, and sleep off whatever nonsense was fueling his entitlement before things escalated beyond words into territory neither of us wanted to explore. Mark snarled back that this was between him and his wife, emphasizing the possessive pronoun with a sneer that twisted his usually handsome features into something feral and unrecognizable, insisting that I back off immediately because no 50-something widow with a hardware store gig had any business meddling in their marital affairs, a comment that nearly drew a bitter laugh from me, since his idea of providing for a family involved more smoke and mirrors than actual substance, but I kept my retort measured, warning him that laying hands on her again, or even showing up uninvited, could lead straight to the police station, where his record of minor infractions might suddenly look a lot more serious under scrutiny. He backed down, eventually muttering curses under his breath about overreacting wives and nosy in-laws before peeling out of the driveway with tires screeching against the asphalt, leaving behind the acrid scent of burned rubber that lingered in the air long after his taillights faded into the night and Sarah emerged from the guest room, pale and shaking, to whisper that he'd surely return, more determined than ever, which only confirmed my fears that bluster alone wouldn't suffice against a man like him who thrived on control and second chances doled out on his terms. By the next morning, with the sun climbing higher over the rooftops, turning the dew-kissed grass into sparkling diamonds, I decided it was time to expand the circle of trust beyond Eagle, driving my reliable old Jeep to the VFW hall on the town's outskirts, that squat brick building with its faded American flag snapping in the breeze, where veterans like me gathered to swap war stories over coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a boot and share the burdens that civilian life sometimes amplified rather than eased. Eagle, whose real name was Tom Riley, a 65-year-old intel specialist from the Vietnam era, with a pronounced limp from shrapnel that never fully healed, waited for me in the back booth away from the cluster of early birds nursing their mugs, and he got straight to the point without preamble, asking for every detail on Sarah's bruises, Mark's affair, and the escalating threats that had prompted my midnight call to activate the plan, which I'd sketched out broadly as a Combination of surveillance, background checks, and targeted disruptions to dismantle his hold without immediately involving law enforcement that often dragged its feet on domestic cases I'd witnessed firsthand through friends' ordeals. Tom nodded thoughtfully, his weathered face creasing deeper as he absorbed the rundown, but then laid out his condition for full involvement, insisting that I reciprocate by helping him chase leads on a cold case from 2008 involving embezzled funds from a veterans charity that had haunted him for years, with suspicions pointing to a former commander still pulling strings in local politics, a favor that grated against my instincts, because diving into that morass could expose me to risks like old adversaries resurfacing or legal entanglements I didn't need. But for Sarah's sake, I agreed, swallowing the dilemma whole, knowing that viewers might shake their heads at my willingness to trade one shadow for another just to keep the momentum going. With Tom's commitment secured, we looped in Lena Kowalski, my old squad mate from basic training, now a licensed private investigator operating out of Cleveland, with a knack for digital forensics that had saved our hides more than once during joint ops, and she jumped in seamlessly, promising to run deeper traces on Mark's finances and connections while I handled the on-the-ground angles back home. By early afternoon, the intel started flowing like a steady stream, revealing that Mark's indiscretions went beyond bedroom betrayals to outright financial sleight of hand, where he'd been skimming deposit money from naive clients on sham property listings, funneling the cash into offshore accounts or lavish gifts for Lacey, who handled the falsified paperwork with a complicity that made my stomach turn, thinking of all the hardworking families like the retired teachers and factory workers who'd trusted him with their nest eggs only to watch their savings vanish into his web of deceit. Armed with that ammunition, I orchestrated the next layer of revenge, drawing on Lena's creativity to pose as a high-powered headhunter from a rival firm, offering Mark an irresistible job interview for a senior sales position, complete with promises of six figures and stock options that had him biting hard enough to clear his schedule and drive 4 grueling hours north to a nondescript hotel conference room where the so-called recruiters turned out to be Tom's network of mischievous veteran pranksters who subjected him to an hour of grilling on his ethical lapses and personal life before vanishing with a parting note taped to the table reading, "We don't hire liars or cheats," leaving him stranded, furious, and out several $100 in gas and tolls as he fumed all the way back to Ohio, a humiliating detour that spread like wildfire through his professional circles via anonymous tips, ensuring his reputation took another witty hit without me ever showing my face. Returning home as the sun dipped low, casting golden hues across the kitchen where Sarah helped chop vegetables for dinner, her mood lighter for the first time in days, buoyed by the small victories we shared over plates of stir-fry laced with stories of Tom's god-awful puns that had us both chuckling despite the undercurrent of tension. She received a pleading voicemail from Mark, his voice cracking with feigned remorse about how he'd hit rock bottom and needed her forgiveness to start fresh, promising therapy and transparency if she'd just come home to talk things out rationally. She played it on speaker, her expression fracturing between empathy and wariness, as she admitted to me that part of her still saw the good in him, the man who'd stood by her during job losses and family illnesses, almost making her waver toward answering his next call. But I counseled patience, urging her to let actions prove words, while inwardly the conflict gnawed at me, wondering if my aggressive tactics were pushing her further into his arms rather than freeing her completely. As night settled in with crickets chirping outside the windows, Tom's call came through with a bombshell update that Mark's shady dealings extended far beyond isolated cons, tying him into a larger scam ring with corrupt local developers peddling fraudulent investment schemes that preyed on the very community we called home, a revelation that transformed this from a personal vendetta into something much more dangerous and interconnected, leaving me staring at the ceiling long after hanging up, grappling with the scope of the web we'd just begun to untangle. The bombshell from Tom's late-night call about Mark's entanglement in that sprawling scam ring with crooked developers who preyed on everyday folks scraping together retirement funds through bogus land deals had me tossing and turning through the small hours, staring at the cracked ceiling of my bedroom where moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped patterns like prison bars on the walls, reminding me how quickly personal grievances could balloon into threats that endangered not just Sarah, but the entire fabric of our close-knit community where trust in neighbors and local businesses formed the backbone of daily life, even as hidden corruptions eroded it from within. By morning, the weight of that knowledge settled over me like a heavy fog as I brewed coffee in the kitchen, listening to the percolator gurgle its way through the grounds, while Sarah slept in longer than usual, her body finally catching up on the rest stolen by nights of worry and whispered arguments that had left her drained both physically and emotionally. And I spent those quiet moments poring over the preliminary files Tom had emailed overnight, detailing how Mark and his accomplices, including that scheming Lacey, had funneled investor money into shell companies disguised as prime real estate opportunities, leaving behind a trail of devastated families, from churchgoers to factory workers who'd poured their life savings into promises of secure futures only to face foreclosures and empty bank accounts. Keeping this deeper layer from Sarah for the time being felt necessary, because unloading the full extent of Mark's criminal web might shatter her fragile progress toward independence, or worse, push her into a defensive spiral where she'd minimize his faults to preserve some illusion of the man she'd married back when his sales pitches seemed charming rather than predatory, a choice that might strike many as reckless, withholding information from her own daughter, but one born from years of navigating crises in the Marines, where timing intel could mean the difference between containment and chaos. We gathered around the kitchen table later that day with plates of ham sandwiches and fresh pickles from the jar I'd canned last summer, sharing a semblance of normalcy as Sarah described a restless night haunted by dreams of confrontations and what-ifs that left her questioning whether staying hidden at my place was truly the right path, or if facing Mark head-on might finally force a clean break. Her words laced with that familiar tug-of-war between fear and lingering affection that made my chest tighten, because I'd seen too many women in similar binds through support groups at the VFW, where stories of abusers' empty vows echoed like bad reruns, trapping victims in cycles of hope and heartbreak. I nodded along, offering honest encouragement about how strength came from setting boundaries, not begging for change from someone who'd proven time and again that his apologies were as substantial as cotton candy dissolving under the slightest pressure, while injecting a touch of wry humor by comparing Mark's flip-flopping reliability to a politician's campaign promises that sounded great on the stump, but fell flat once the votes were counted. A light vulgarity in my tone, suggesting his so-called manhood was about as sturdy as a wet paper bag in a downpour, without crossing into outright barbs that might make her bristle and retreat. Throughout the afternoon, we tackled practical steps like her packing a few more clothes from the rental house during a quick supervised run, with Lena tailing at a distance to ensure no ambushes, and discussing options for a restraining order, though I held back on pushing too hard for immediate police involvement, because in our small town the system often favored connected locals like Mark with his developer buddies over outsiders, crying foul, a hesitation that could rub folks the wrong way, seeing it as enabling danger rather than the calculated risk it was meant to be, allowing me to build an airtight case through Tom's network instead of relying on badges that might tip him off prematurely. But Mark didn't afford us the luxury of patience, showing up unannounced 2 evenings later as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, his SUV pulling up to the curb with a deliberate crunch of gravel that set my nerves on edge, prompting me to usher Sarah into the living room out of sight while I approached the door with measured steps, the peephole confirming his presence, bouquet of wilting daisies clutched in one hand like a prop from a bad rom-com, his face a mask of contrived remorse that didn't quite hide the calculating glint in his eyes from years of closing deals on shaky foundations. Against every screaming instinct, I invited him inside, figuring a controlled confrontation on my turf might expose his true colors more effectively than avoidance, because psychology from my training days taught that abusers unraveled fastest when their manipulations were mirrored back unflinchingly, and Sarah needed to witness that firsthand to sever the emotional cords still binding her, even if it meant walking a tightrope over potential violence that had me palming my phone ready to dial for backup at the first wrong move. We settled uneasily at the scarred dining table, the flowers tossed carelessly aside as he launched into his rehearsed speech about hitting rock bottom after her departure, blaming work stress and that one-time lapse with Lacey as a meaningless distraction born of Temptation rather than intent, while professing undying love for Sarah and a commitment to counseling sessions starting next week if she'd only return home to rebuild their life away from my so-called interference, a narrative so polished. It might have swayed a jury, but I saw through it like glass, leaning forward to counter with calm precision by acknowledging his stress, then pivoting to the hard truths about how true partnership didn't involve secret accounts or slaps in anger, let alone scamming folks out of their hard-earned cash through those shady investments Lena's probes had illuminated. His reaction was immediate, the color draining from his face as he stammered denials about any financial wrongdoing, insisting I must be confusing him with someone else. But I pressed on, casual as a chat over fences, dropping fabricated details from Tom's fabricated leaks like specific transaction dates and client names that had him shifting in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead until he bolted upright, knocking the chair backward with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot lunging toward me in a flash of rage that screamed cornered animal more than remorseful husband. Sarah gasped from the doorway where she'd crept to listen, but I sidestepped, fluidly drawing on defensive maneuvers from hand-to-hand drills to grab his wrist in a compliance hold, twisting just enough to force him to his knees without inflicting real harm. His yelp mixing pain and surprise as I warned low and steady that touching me or her again would end with him in cuffs and his whole operation crumbling under federal scrutiny, because anonymous packets were already en route to the authorities courtesy of concerned whistleblowers who knew how to connect the dots from assaults to embezzlement. He wrenched free, scrambling back toward the door, sputtering threats about lawsuits and ruined lives, but the seed of doubt I'd planted took root in his wide-eyed retreat, tires squealing as he fled into the night, leaving Sarah staring at me with a storm of emotions, gratitude warring with accusation as she demanded why I'd provoked him like that, risking everything when calling the cops would have been simpler and safer, a valid point that gnawed at me because my choice to handle it personally skirted the law in ways that could backfire spectacularly, making viewers perhaps judge me harshly for prioritizing vigilante cleverness over protocol, even as it empowered her to see his fragility. For the revenge that followed, I escalated with technological precision, coordinating with Lena to access Mark's SUV through a contact in auto security who'd owed me a favor from a past op, remotely locking the brakes and disabling the ignition during his rush hour commute the next day, stranding him dead in the middle of the interstate amid a chorus of blaring horns and frustrated commuters who pulled over to gawk and snap photos that inevitably went viral on local social media feeds, painting him as the hapless fool, broken down both literally and figuratively, a witty sabotage that cost him hours of delay, a tow bill, and fresh humiliation, without a trace leading back to me, satisfying in its irony as he fumed roadside, realizing his world was shrinking faster than he could scheme his way out. Sarah and I shared a tense dinner afterward, her silence speaking volumes about the growing rift between my aggressive path and her desire for a quieter resolution. But as midnight approached, I heard the faint creak of the front door from my bedroom, alerting me to slip out, only to find her gone, a hastily scrawled note on the counter explaining she needed to meet Mark one last time to end things her way, leaving me gripped by panic as I grabbed my keys, wondering into what trap she'd just walked willingly. Sarah's impulsive note about needing to confront Mark on her own terms sent me bolting from the house in my battered Jeep, the engine roaring to life under the cover of midnight stars that dotted the sky like distant witnesses to the unfolding drama, while I fumbled for my phone to dial Tom, whose gravelly voice answered on the second ring, already anticipating the crisis from the tension in my terse update about her slipping away to that seedy motel on the outskirts where desperate conversations often turned volatile, and he promised to trace her signal immediately, leveraging the same digital wizardry Lena had used earlier to pinpoint locations without alerting authorities prematurely, a move that carried its own risks of overstepping into surveillance territory that could complicate things legally, but felt essential in a town where police response times stretched thin for non-emergencies, like a grown woman's choice to meet her estranged husband. The 15-minute drive felt eternal, weaving through empty streets lined with sleeping ranch homes and the occasional flicker of porch lights from night owls catching the news or nursing their own private worries, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios, from heated words escalating to violence reminiscent of the bruises she'd already endured to the possibility that Mark's scam ring connections might turn this into something far more sinister, involving enforcers who'd silence loose ends before they unraveled the whole operation. which only amplified the uncertainty gnawing at me because my aggressive interventions had perhaps pushed her toward this reckless step seeking closure, without my shadow looming over every decision, a dilemma that might make outsiders view me as the overbearing force, fracturing her autonomy rather than the protector I'd always aimed to be. Tom's ping came through just as I hit the motel's neon-lit parking lot, that garish sign buzzing faintly above the row of identical doors, each hiding stories of regret and fleeting escapes, and I parked at the edge scanning for Mark's SUV, which sat crookedly near room 12, its engine still ticking cool under the hood, suggesting a recent arrival that set my nerves jangling as I crept forward, phone in hand, ready to summon help if shouts or scuffles broke the night's hush, only to pause at the partially open door where Sarah's voice rose sharp and accusatory over Mark's defensive baritone, painting a picture of confrontation without immediate blows as she demanded answers about the lies and the other woman, while he countered with pleas for understanding, laced with blame shifting toward her suspicions that had supposedly driven him to stray. Bursting inside with a forceful shove, I pulled Sarah behind me, her eyes widening in surprise, mixed with relief, as Mark whirled around, his face a storm of fury and desperation. The bouquet from his earlier visit now wilted on the bedside table like a symbol of his failed charms, and he lunged forward, snarling that I'd ruined everything by poisoning her against him, but I held my ground, channeling the calm authority from command positions in the Corps to lay out the unvarnished truth in measured tones about the affair with Lacey, the skimmed funds from trusting clients, and the broader scam ring that preyed on vulnerable families, turning their dreams into nightmares through fraudulent deeds and vanished deposits, all backed by the irrefutable evidence Tom's team had compiled, from bank logs to incriminating emails that painted Mark not as a stressed husband, but as a calculated predator who'd gambled away other security for his fleeting thrills. He laughed bitterly, at first a hollow sound echoing off the thin walls, but it cracked into denial as I revealed specifics like the offshore transfers to Lacey's accounts and the forged signatures on deals that had bankrupted a local widow from our church group, someone Sarah knew from bake sales and holiday fairs. The weight of that personal connection hitting her like a wave as she gasped, realizing the man she defended harbored depths of deceit far beyond domestic spats. Mark's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, and he fumbled for it, dialing what he claimed were lawyer friends to counter the accusations, but Lena's voice crackled in my hidden earpiece, confirming the intercept, with Tom's network flooding those so-called allies with anonymous dossiers that exposed their own complicit roles, prompting frantic hang-ups and distancing statements that left Mark isolated, his empire crumbling in real time as distant sirens wailed closer, drawn by a tip I'd authorized earlier, framing this as an active fraud investigation rather than just a family dispute to ensure swift response without tipping our hand prematurely. In the ensuing chaos, as officers swarmed the room cuffing Mark amid his sputtering protests about false claims and harassment, Sarah whispered a confession that twisted the knife deeper, admitting she'd suspected the financial irregularities for months, piecing together odd deposits and evasive answers, but chosen silence, hoping to confront him privately and steer him toward reform rather than blowing up their life, a revelation that stunned me because it implicated her, however peripherally, in the web of denial, turning my protective fury inward toward questions of how much she'd overlooked to preserve the facade, a moral gray area that could provoke disagreement among those listening about whether her complicity diluted her victimhood or simply humanized the messiness of staying in a toxic bond too long. With Mark hauled away and the squad car lights flashing against the motel's faded facade, I orchestrated the final stroke of revenge through a coordinated leak to the local paper, where Tom's contacts ensured front-page headlines screamed real estate rogue busted wife's mom exposes multi-million scam, complete with grainy photos of his disheveled arrest and Lacey's hasty plea deal, spilling details for immunity that painted the ring in vivid strokes of greed and betrayal, spreading like gossip at the county fair through social media shares and water cooler talks that shredded Mark's reputation irreparably among the very clients and neighbors who'd once praised his salesmanship, a witty public reckoning that satisfied the itch for justice without courtroom theatrics, costing him endorsements, deals, and any semblance of respect in our tight community, while Lacey slithered toward lesser charges, her fate hanging ambiguous, like so many threads left dangling. Weeks blurred into a tentative normalcy, with Sarah filing divorce papers and dipping into therapy sessions at the community center, where she unpacked the layers of manipulation that had kept her tethered, her tentative smiles over shared meals hinting at healing, but shadowed by unspoken strains from my heavy-handed role that had saved her yet strained our bond as she occasionally withdrew into silences that spoke of resentment toward my unyielding plan. Staring at that old uniform now tucked back in the closet, its metals catching dust in the morning light, I reflect on the costs, wondering if this shadow of justice mended the fractures or merely traded one set of scars for deeper ones, with questions lingering about whether Lacey truly escaped unscathed, if Sarah's loyalty might waver under future temptations, or if my hidden regrets from bending rules in the name of love will ever surface to haunt us both, leaving the ending open to interpretation. In a world where right and wrong blur as easily as ink and rain,